Christina, do you think that there's a political dimension of this, that the government feels there's nothing the government can do, so it's not going to warn the population because it might generate hysteria? I mean, is that the sort of reasoning that may be taking place at the highest levels? Because our government has to be aware of the scientific facts that Leuren is relating here. They're simply not sharing them with the public.
Oh, sure. And what's been, suggested to me during bomb testing is that, they knew what the explosions would do. What they wanted to find out is what it would do to the downwind population. And if you read books like Secret Fallout by Dr. Ernest Sternglass, he talks about how people in the areas where they were conducting nuclear weapons tests, the government would give the people free car washes, and they would measure the cars for contamination before the wash and afterward because they wanted to see how successful decontamination would be. We're being experimented on, and the only thing that's being controlled about this accident is us. Our government's well aware of the research, and back since the 1920s, we've known that even low levels of radiation greatly disrupts DNA. And they've continued to introduce this into our environment, and whether it is to make a sick population that will then, the healthcare industry will be able to generate more revenue from, or if it's for control reasons. I don't know as much about that as Leuren does from the historical or political perspective.
Well, but it's just so obvious that you're right that we are being used as experimental subjects, but without our consent. So this is a gross violations of the ethics for experimentation with human subjects, which the government, of course, its own agencies are supposed to be upholding, but in fact the government itself is grossly violating.
Well, 85% of the key positions in the U.S. government are held by skull and bones men from Yale, and skull and bones leads us directly to the London financiers and the Anglo-American Permanent War Crimes Racketeering Syndicate.
So you're suggesting that Yale and Skull and Bones are really a conduit for producing intel operatives and corrupt officials for the American government to maintain its course in relation with DHS, Homeland Security, the CIA, and so forth.
I think that there's plenty of evidence that has been, out in the public venue that supports that. But I'd like to go back to the bomb testing effects. Now, Christina said, of course, the government knew, and I'd just like to provide some evidence that supports what she's saying. In the later 2000s, I was testifying in the Nevada legislature and working as a research staff scientist at the Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Weapons Lab, and we were studying the metal canisters and doing pilot studies in New Mexico and in Nevada on storing nuclear waste in this special metal alloy cans. And I met a woman who was actually a Rothschild. She told me secretly, but not to tell anyone. And she was very impressed with the work I was doing. So she went to all of the meetings there in Pahrump, which is a little tiny town near the Nevada test site. And she found out that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, actually had a secret dairy at the Nevada test site all through nuclear bomb testing. And they were measuring the radiation in cows, in calves, and in their own workers who shoveled manure and fed the cattle in that dairy. They also had cattle herds, meat-producing herds that they were also testing, and that was classified. But she went to town, and she actually got the report declassified and gave it to me. Another piece of evidence is that cattle mutilation during bomb testing began to be reported, and it really turned into a very big issue in the U.S. And what and a radiation activist told me was that he walked into an office one day in the Midwest, another activist office, about this cattle mutilation, and they had a stick pin map where they had put a stick pin for each cattle mutilation reported across the U.S. He said they were all downriver or downwind from nuclear facilities. And the sheriff in one county actually went up to a black helicopter that had landed at a very tiny airport out in the wildlands, the farmland, and discovered it was Army personnel with samples of tissue from cattle. They'd mutilated cattle in that area. And it was the Army taking samples from horses, cattle, killing them, and then throwing them out of the helicopter after they sampled them, or leaving them on the ground smelling like formaldehyde. And this has been a military operation the whole time to monitor the health effects, the radiation levels, and the samples were always taken in the cattle from the eyeballs, that usually has the lowest radiation level in the body, from the rectum and different organs in the cattle. It was very systematic. We also know that what happened in the bomb test period is happening now to monitor the Fukushima radiation. And what they're doing is there's a big effort by the military and the nuclear establishment to manipulate the vital statistics of the U.S. and other countries by secretly aborting, forcing women with defective fetuses to abort them. And then it's reported in the vital statistics to the Centers for Disease Control from each county as voluntary abortions by these women. And that keeps the birth defects and so forth out of the vital statistics at the Centers for Disease Control. And of course, these statistics are used globally. So they're fudging everything.
So these are feti that actually are suffering serious genetic abnormalities, but they're
Yes.
covering it by...
And they have special units now set up in the county hospitals where they're sending poor women, Native Americans, African American women, poor people, and forcing them to have abortions, because the food streams in the United States into different populations and different socioeconomic groups are also contaminated with radiation. The highest levels are in the poor populations, the poor sector of minorities and poor people. And the best food, the cleanest food, for instance, you can buy at Whole Foods, where they are importing food from the Southern Hemisphere, and they always have been since they went into operation and became a corporation and a food provider for the U.S. So food streams are also being poisoned.
Well, it's just stunning. There are those, of course, who surmise that this is actually something that's being allowed to happen in order to contribute to the depopulation of the world. And, you know, one might think that presumes a rather cynical point of view, but the government really doesn't seem to be doing anything that it could do to protect the interests, the health and welfare of the population, the citizens of the United States in this instance.
Well, it's hard to believe. It's really, really surreal. It's Orwellian. It's a nightmare. But a very, very interesting book has been published called Political Ponerology. And ponerology is the science, it's a science on the nature of evil. This particular book is addressing political purposes, political ponerology. And it's by Andrew Lobachevsky, who died recently, but he and a group of scientists in Poland wrote this book about the evil politicians during the Soviet era. The book had to be burned by him because he was told that the Polish intelligence was coming to his house to take it. And he and some of the scientists moved to the Soviet Union, rewrote it, published it. The same thing happened there. He came to the U.S. and he finally published it in his late 80s in the U.S. in about 1985 or 90. But Brzezinski blocked it from being published. It's finally been published, and if people are interested in how things like this can happen to humanity and to the biosphere and to this planet, it's a very, very interesting book.
And Leuren, on that note, we're going to have to take our break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my two very special guest experts on Fukushima, Christina Consolo and Leuren Moret. Will be right back.